127th. That's after the miracle. Labor productivity went up 84%, and farm incomes have collapsed. Poor rural families are consuming 100 kilograms of grain less annually than they did just a few years ago, and that's serious. The number of farm households in debt has just about doubled in the years of the reforms. The government itself admits to 110,000 farm suicides in the past decade. The actual numbers are much higher. It's mostly driven by debt. India does have great software, biology labs, and so on. The raves from Thomas Friedman are correct. I've seen the labs. They're as good as MIT. But just a couple of miles away from these great labs, peasant suicides are escalating. Same reasons. State funding is shifting to high-tech industry and therefore going away from something else. What it's going away from is the needs of the vast majority of the population, poor farmers. So agricultural support, research stations, rural credit, irrigation, it's all collapsing. And farmers are being trained in the best principles of economics. You should produce export crops. That's what economic theory tells you. So produce cotton, not subsistence food for your family and your community. Well, there's a slight problem with that that doesn't enter into economic theory. One problem is that commodity export prices for things like cotton fluctuate all over the map. They go up one year and way down the next year. Well, that's not a big problem for agribusiness. They can kind of average it out. But if you're a poor farmer, just a little above the subsistence level, you can't tell your children, don't bother eating next year, maybe we'll make some money the year after. So what you have to do is borrow money to carry you over, but there's no rural credit. So you have to go to the local usurer, who charges something like credit card companies. Once you get in debt, you're finished. China is a little harder to investigate because it's a pretty totalitarian society. India is open, so you can learn what's going on. But it's apparently pretty much the same. And remember, those are the great success stories. Well, if you look at come back to the United States, the state sector, that means your taxes, have been funding growth for years, taking the risks and funding it. And the funding is shifting. Pentagon funding is declining and shifting from the National Institute of Health and other health-related parts of the government is going up. You can see it at MIT. Just take a look at the funding that goes on. Why is that happening? Well, there's a pretty good reason for it. In the early post-war period, say the first 25 years, the cutting edge of the economy was electronics-based. And the way to fool the public into paying for that is to scream, the Russians are coming, or Grenada's coming, or somebody, and then we have to have a big defense system, and meanwhile you can develop computers and the internet and microelectronics and so on and so forth, and hand it over to private corporations. But by now the cutting edge of the economy is biology-based. So therefore government funding has to shift. You have to have some other excuse for government funding. We'll cure cancer, or whatever it is. Meanwhile, you get genetic engineering and biotechnology and so on being paid for by the same people, namely you, with the profits going to whatever private corporations will be able to milk them when something's developed. There are other devices, like one critical part of the so-called trade agreements is what's called intellectual property rights. That's a fancy term that means state-guaranteed monopoly pricing rights. So pharmaceutical corporations can charge very high prices because they have a monopoly. The monopoly is given to them by state power under the pretext of free trade. They claim that they need it for research and development, but that's a fraud. It's been investigated. It's been well investigated by Dean Baker, a very good economist. You can get some information about this on an excellent book that he just wrote, which is actually free. You can pick it up online, called The Conservative Nanny State, which describes the real economy. One part of it has to do with production of drugs. He calculated that if the amount of the companies do some research and development, but mostly at the marketing end. And he calculated that if you increased the state subsidy to 100% and forced the companies on the market, drug prices would be a huge saving to consumers. But that's not the way really existing capitalism works. Let's turn to NAFTA in 1994. Something else happened in 1994. Coincident with NAFTA. It's called Operation Gatekeeper. As soon as NAFTA was instituted, the Clinton administration instituted Operation Gatekeeper, which militarized the U.S.-Mexico border. Previously, that had been an open border, like most borders. It was established by conquest, but pretty much the same people lived on both sides. They crossed the borders in both directions to visit their friends and relatives. But that wasn't going to work anymore after NAFTA. You had to militarize it. Now, it's, of course, much more extreme. Why? Well, it was understood what the effect of NAFTA was going to be for Mexico. Mexican farmers were not going to be able to compete with subsidized, state-subsidized U.S. agribusiness. Mexican business was not going to be able to compete with huge U.S. corporations, also state-subsidized in many ways. So there's going to be, people are going to flee. Well, some of them can flee to maquiladoras on the border, but a lot of them are just going to flee to the United States. And they're going to be joined by the people fleeing from the wreckage of Washington's terrorist wars in Central America in the 80s and much more. So what's the solution? The solution is to build a wall. You know, first destroy the economies and keep them out. There is a real solution. Promote, or at least permit, development. But that's counter to the interests of those who pretty much rule the world, or at least own it, or at least hope to. Well, control of Latin America was the earliest and has been the major goal of U.S. foreign policy, and it remains very central. That's partly for resources, markets, investment, and so on, but also for ideological reasons, which are quite important, and they're discussed in the internal record, secret record, where people point out, planners point out, that we cannot expect to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world unless we control Latin America. It's kind of, you can't do that, how are we going to control the rest of the world? So it's important to keep it under control, more than for just straight economic reasons. Well, there are traditional methods of control, violence and economic strangulation, but they're losing their effectiveness. U.S. military coups used to be routine. The most recent attempt was 2002 in Venezuela. Washington, of course, supported the coup, may have instigated it. The coup installed a rich businessman, Pedro Carmona. His first act was to disband Parliament, eliminate the Supreme Court, and get rid of every other vestige of democracy. We've supported it, of course. That's called democracy promotion. Well, that was quickly reversed. It was a popular uprising, restored the elected government, and Washington had to turn to subversion, propaganda war, and very substantial aid to the supporters of the coup under the guise, of course, of democracy promotion. So, for example, the opposition candidate in the election in a couple of days supported the coup. Can you imagine what would happen in the United States if there was a military coup and one of its supporters then ran for president? I mean, first of all, it never happened because he'd have been killed before that. But the press, which supported the military coup, is publishing freely. That's why Chavez is denounced as a dictator who doesn't allow free press. If there was a military coup here, say in the New York Times, supported it, they'd of course be